Captain Vex Garrett had always said space was a bastard. Cold, unforgiving, and full of surprises, most of them bad. Which is why, when the ardent star popped up on their scopes like a bad penny, she wasn't even a little bit surprised. Just annoyed. "I swear," she muttered, clutching the console, "if it's another batch of space tourists frozen to death in their cryopods, I'm gonna lose it." Next to her, Taro, her sarcastic second-in-command, smirked. "What do you expect, Cap? Luxury cruises didn't exactly plan for engine failure and cosmic drift." "No, they didn't," Vex sighed, watching the derelict colony ship spin lazily against the planet's endless night. It looked like a relic from a forgotten age of optimism, back when people thought they could just flit between stars like it was a Sunday drive. "We boarding this hunk of junk or just admiring it from afar?" Taro asked, already booting up the docking sequences. Vex rolled her eyes. "What's life without a little risk?" "Sane," Taro offered, but he was already strapping into his harness. The rest of the crew took their cues from Taro, double-checking equipment with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this dance far too often. There was Jenks, the engineer, who could fix anything with some duct tape and a prayer, and Lua, the medic, who had the bedside manner of a drill sergeant, all bark, no bite. "All right, team," Vex barked, pulling her helmet on. "Let's go greet our frozen ancestors." The shuttle maneuvered towards the ardent star with all the grace of a drunk stumbling home. Vex watched their approach on the monitors, half expecting something to go horribly wrong and half disappointed when they docked without incident. "So far, so good," she murmured, waiting for the inevitable chaos to unfold. The airlock hissed open and they were met with silence, the kind that hangs heavy like a guilty secret. The corridors stretched on, empty and dark, their flashlights carving out cones of light in the gloom. "Creepy," Jenks whispered, his voice echoing down the metal halls. "I feel like I'm in one of those old horror vids." "Great," Lewis snorted. "If a psycho in a mask jumps out, I'm shooting first, asking questions later." "Just don't shoot me," Taro quipped, leading the way with the swagger of someone who hadn't quite learned what fear was supposed to feel like. They drifted through the ship, finding nothing but empty bunks and ghostly echoes of lives left behind. "Where's all the people?" Vex asked, more to herself than anyone else. This was supposed to be a colony ship, not a ghost ship. "Maybe they all just up and left," Jenks suggested, peering into a crew room. "Decided Mars was overrated." "Yeah, sure, because everyone loves abandoning a ship mid-journey," Lua replied. "Makes perfect sense." The deeper they went, the more the ship seemed to warp around them, as if reality itself was fraying at the edges. Hallways seemed to stretch longer, doors opening onto rooms they'd already passed. "You seeing this, Cap?" Taro asked, stopping to stare at a console that flickered in and out of existence like a bad hologram. "Yeah," Vex said, frowning. "It's like the ship's got a mind of its own, or the universe is playing a practical joke." "Not a funny one," Jenks grumbled, tapping his helmet nervously. "Can we get out of here?" "My skin's crawling." "Soon," Vex replied, though she wasn't so sure. There was something here, something just out of sight, and she wasn't keen on leaving empty-handed. They pressed on, moving cautiously, as if expecting the walls to reach out and grab them. Every so often, they'd hear a distant clatter or the ghostly whisper of a long-dead conversation. "I've seen enough," Lua eventually said, scanning another empty room. "This place is dead as a doornail." "Not quite," Vex said, pointing to a flickering console at the end of the corridor. "Looks like we've got company." The terminal blinked on and off, trying to communicate in bursts of static and code. Jenks moved forward, fingers flying over the keys. "Looks like an old distress signal," he said, brow furrowed. "Can't make out much, but something's been trying to broadcast for a long time." "What's it saying?" Taro asked. Jenks paused. "Just help," over and over. Vex felt a shiver run down her spine. "Great, a cry for help from beyond the grave." "Well, if they're dead, they're not screaming anymore," Lua pointed out. "Small blessings." As if on cue, the lights around them flickered, plunging the corridor into darkness. "Oh, come on," Taro groaned. "First ghosts, now power failures. What's next, killer AI?" "Don't jinx it," Vex snapped, fumbling for her flashlight. "Let's just find the source of that signal and get the hell out." With the ship in eerie silence, they pressed on, the sense of being watched growing with every step. Vex couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than they'd bargained for. "Cap, you sure about this?" Jenks asked, his usual bravado gone. "No," Vex admitted, "but when have we ever let that stop us?" As they approached the source of the distress signal, the air shimmered like heat haze, and Vex felt a strange pulling sensation, as if the ship itself was trying to swallow them whole. "I don't like this," Lua said, her voice tight. "Join the club," Vex replied, stepping forward to find what waited beyond the veil of static and shadows. Then, just as they rounded the corner, reality seemed to hiccup, and everything went white. When the world refocused, they were no longer in the corridor. Instead, they stood in what looked like a control room from a time long gone, consoles beeping softly, the semblance of life where there should be none. "What the hell?" Taro started, but the words died on his lips as figures materialized around them, half-formed and flickering like old film reels. "Well," Vex said, forcing a smirk she didn't feel. "Isn't this cozy?" The figures seemed trapped in a cycle, repeating the same motions in a loop, unaware of their new audience. Among them, a man in a captain's uniform turned, mouth moving in silent orders. "They don't see us," Jenks whispered, fascinated. "Or they're ignoring us," Lua countered. "Either way, I'm not sticking around for the finale." "Agreed," Vex said, but as they tried to retrace their steps, the world around them shifted again, pulling them deeper into the ship's forgotten memories. "I think we've overstayed our welcome," Taro said, his voice tinged with nerves. Vex nodded, though she doubted it would be that easy. The ardent star had them now, and she had a feeling it wasn't going to let go without a fight. "Keep your eyes open," she instructed, scanning the room for anything they could use to break free. "And if anyone's got a brilliant idea, now's the time." Jenks raised a hand, grinning wryly. "How about we don't die?" "That sound good to everyone." "Best idea I've heard all day," Vex replied, feeling the familiar thrill of danger, the kind that made her feel alive even as it threatened to kill her. Together, they moved deeper into the ship's twisted labyrinth, hoping against hope that they could outrun the shadows of the past before they became a part of them. Vex Garrett had a long list of things she hated about space, but time rifts were slowly clawing their way to the top. Right above, dodgy space food, and just below, accidentally stumbling upon derelict colony ships that seemed to rewrite the rules of reality. "All right, team," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Looks like our little ghost ship's got a few tricks up its sleeve." "Tricks like turning a corridor into a Renaissance fair," Taro muttered, eyeing their surroundings with the kind of disdain usually reserved for suspiciously cheap drinks. The room they found themselves in was a far cry from the sterile corridors of the ardent star. Instead, it was filled with figures that looked as if they'd stepped out of a history book. Warriors from various Earth cultures, their armor clinking softly in the strange silence, swords and shields at the ready. "Let me guess," Jenks started, a nervous grin on his face. "They're going to jump out and shout surprise any second now, right?" "If that's the case, someone forgot the cake," Lua chimed in, her hand hovering over her weapon. "And I'm not in the mood for a party." As if on cue, one of the warriors, a Viking, if Vex's patchy history knowledge served her right, turned his head, icy eyes fixing on them with an unsettling intensity. His lips moved, the words lost to time, but his intent was clear. Cap," Jenks said slowly, edging backward. "I think they are about to get all historical on our asses." Vex would have liked to think they could reason with the warriors. Maybe offer them a beer and a chat about how ridiculously outdated swords were. But experience had taught her that time-displaced warriors were rarely the conversational type. "Retreat," Taro suggested, already backing away. "Sounds good to me." "Best idea I've heard all day," Vex replied, turning on her heel and making a break for it as the warriors advanced, their movements quick and purposeful despite being centuries out of their own time. The crew stumbled back through the corridor, the echoes of their footsteps mingling with the clatter of ancient armor. It was like being chased by a particularly dedicated group of cosplayers who'd taken things a bit too seriously. "Where the hell did they come from?" Lua shouted, her voice bouncing off the walls. "Last I checked, Vikings didn't have a space program." "Guess nobody told them that," Jenks replied, breathing hard. "Doesn't matter," Vex said, skidding to a halt as they rounded a corner that seemed suspiciously longer than it had been before. "We just need to lose them." "Fat chance," Taro shot back, glancing over his shoulder. "They look like they are auditioning for a marathon." The crew pushed on, dodging through the maze-like corridors as their pursuers gained ground. It was the kind of situation that made Vex question her life choices. Like why she hadn't pursued a safer career, like asteroid mining or juggling live grenades. "Think they'd fancy a game of hide and seek?" Jenks panted, trying to keep up. "Sure," Lua said, sarcasm dripping from every word. "Right after they finished their game of stab the spacemen." Vex swerved into another corridor, her instincts screaming that the ship was actively working against them, leading them in circles. The distant sound of battle cries echoed, a promise of violence if they didn't move fast. "We've got to find a way to close that rift," Vex said, grimacing as she realized just how insane that sounded. "Before we end up as extras in their little historical reenactment." "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Cap?" Taro asked, dodging a low-hanging conduit. "Wave a magic wand and hope for the best." "Something like that," Vex admitted, scanning the walls for anything that might resemble a control panel. Anything that screamed "off switch for temporal anomalies" in bold letters. "Cap, over here," Jenks yelled, pointing to a console that flickered with ancient light, projecting a holographic interface that seemed to shimmer between outdated and futuristic designs. "Better than nothing," Vex decided, sprinting towards it with the others in tow. She skidded to a halt, fingers flying over the interface, hoping she could make sense of the mess before the warriors caught up. "Christmas lights make more sense than this," she muttered, trying button combinations and hoping to get lucky. A loud clang echoed behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Vex didn't need to glance back to know the warriors were closing in. "Anytime now, Cap," Taro urged, his voice tight with urgency. "Working on it," Vex shot back, cursing under her breath. "This damn thing's about as user-friendly as a bear trap." Lua unslung her weapon, checking the charge with a practiced flick of her wrist. "I'll try to buy us some time," she said, nodding to Taro to back her up. Vex barely registered them moving into position, too focused on the console that seemed determined to thwart her attempts at saving their skins. She could hear the warriors, their guttural cries sending chills down her spine. "Got it!" Jenks suddenly exclaimed, reaching past Vex to flip a switch she hadn't noticed. The console flashed, the holographic display shifting to something more coherent. "Care to share with the class?" Vex asked, her heart pounding. "It's a stabilizer," Jenks explained, a manic grin plastered on his face. "Hit this and it should close the rift, at least in theory." "Good enough for me," Vex said, slamming her hand on the panel. The ship shuddered, a deep rumble reverberating through the halls as the lights dimmed. The time rift flickered, a swirling vortex of light collapsing in on itself just as the warriors rounded the corner. For a moment, Vex feared they were too late, but the warriors halted, confusion etching their features before they began to fade, an echo of their once formidable presence. "I think we did it," Jenks breathed, as the warriors vanished like smoke in the wind. "About time something went right," Lua added, lowering her weapon. Vex let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Okay, let's get the hell out of here before the ship decides to throw another curveball." The crew retraced their steps, the corridors strangely silent now, as if the ship was sulking after having its fun spoiled. Vex didn't trust it for a second, casting wary glances at the walls as they hurried back towards the airlock. "So, what's the plan?" Taro asked, once they'd reached the docking bay. "We report back, collect our hazard pay, and maybe look for a nice, quiet planet to crash on for a while," Vex suggested, stepping into the shuttle. Sounds like a plan, Jenks agreed, strapping himself in with the speed of someone who never wanted to set foot on the ardent star again. The shuttle detached, pulling away from the derelict ship with a hum of relief. Vex watched as the ardent star receded into the void, her mind already racing with ways to spin their little misadventure into something that wouldn't get them court-martialed. "You think this'll make the news?" Lua asked, a smirk playing at her lips. "Only if we're unlucky," Vex replied, settling into her seat as the shuttle shot off into the stars. "And I'm about done with that kind of luck." Taro leaned back, his usual irreverence returning. "Well, at least we didn't die. I call that a win." "High standards we've got," Jenks quipped, rolling his eyes. "Next thing you know, we'll be celebrating when the air recyclers don't explode." "Hey, a win's a win," Vex said, watching as the stars streaked by. "And I'll take it, even if it's just for today." As the crew settled into the familiar hum of the shuttle, Vex allowed herself a moment to relax, tension slipping away as they left the ardent star behind. Space was still a bastard, but at least for now they'd outsmarted it. "Let's hope the next job is a little less eventful," Jenks said, closing his eyes. "Knowing us," Lua replied, chuckling. "Not a chance." The crew laughed, the sound echoing softly in the cabin, a comforting reminder that despite the madness of the universe, they still had each other. "Here's to surviving another day," Vex said, raising an imaginary glass. "Cheers to that," Taro and the others echoed, letting the tension of the day melt away into the vastness of space. As the shuttle sailed on, Vex couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, they'd earned a bit of peace and quiet. But then again, she knew better than to make assumptions in this line of work. The universe always had a way of keeping things interesting. Vex Garrett leaned against the cold, unforgiving wall of the ardent star. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her mind raced with possible solutions that didn't involve getting skewered by a misplaced Viking or cut down by a Roman legionnaire. The historical warriors were still lurking around the corner, undoubtedly wondering how they'd ended up on a spaceship instead of pillaging and plundering back in their own time. "Okay, team," Vex said, offering a weak grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "New plan. Let's try talking to them before they decide to turn us into kebabs." Jenks snorted, his nervous grin back in full force. "Yeah, because nothing says let's have a nice chat like a guy with a battle axe." "Got a better idea," Vex shot back, eyebrow arched. Jenks opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Point taken." Taro pushed away from the wall, skepticism oozing from every pore. "And what exactly are we going to say? Hello, time-displaced warriors. Welcome to the future. Please keep your arms and legs inside the rift at all times." "Something like that," Vex replied, rubbing her temples. "We just need to figure out how to communicate. Maybe we can use their language or, I don't know, mime." "Really?" Lua muttered as she checked over her weapon. "Because pantomime is the universal language of peace, right?" Vex rolled her eyes. "Look, if you have any brilliant ideas, I'm all ears." Lua shrugged, the corners of her mouth twitching upwards. "How about we try not to die horribly? That's always a good start." "First time for everything," Taro said dryly, peering around the corner at their historical guests. "Hey, maybe we can tell them their gods will be really pissed if they kill us." Vex chuckled humorlessly. "Great. Let's add blasphemy to the list of reasons why they might want us dead. All right, let's go say hello." With exaggerated caution, they edged back into the corridor, where the warriors were still trying to make sense of their metallic surroundings. Vex stepped forward, raising her hands in what she hoped looked like a gesture of peace and not like she was surrendering. Hey there," she began, her voice echoing off the walls. "We come in peace." The Viking, who seemed to be the unofficial spokesperson for the time-traveling warriors, grunted something that sounded suspiciously like a curse. Or maybe it was just a greeting in Old Norse. Vex wasn't about to split hairs. "Okay, language barrier not ideal," Vex mumbled, glancing at Taro. "Didn't you take some ancient history classes?" Taro snorted. "Yeah, but they didn't exactly cover how to politely ask a time-lost warrior to not kill you." Jenks, ever the optimist, waved cheerily. "Maybe we should just smile and wave. It worked for penguins, right?" The Viking squinted at them, as if trying to determine their threat level. Probably somewhere between mildly annoying and utterly confusing. Try gesturing, Lua suggested, crossing her arms. Use your hands, act like you're offering something. Right, because I carry around an emergency gift basket, Vex replied with a sigh. Still, she nodded, slowly reaching for her utility belt and pulling out a small energy bar. She held it out, hoping it didn't come across as a bribe. The Viking stared at the bar like it was an alien artifact, which technically on this ship it was. After a moment's hesitation, he took it, sniffing it cautiously. Wow, they really are just like us, Taro quipped. Give a guy a snack and suddenly he's your best friend. Let's hope he doesn't have any allergies, Jenks muttered, watching the Viking nibble on the energy bar. Can you imagine explaining that to his chieftain? The Viking grunted again, this time with what might have been approval. Vex took that as a good sign, gesturing to the ship around them and then pointing back at the rift, which still shimmered ominously in the corridor. We need to get you back through there, Vex said, doing a sort of awkward interpretive dance of pointing and waving. Back to your own time. No offense, but this whole historical war reenactment in space thing isn't really working for us. The Viking frowned, clearly not following her stellar charades but interested nonetheless. It was a start. Vex turned to Lua, tilting her head towards the rift. Think you can work your magic with that stabilizer panel? Vex asked. Maybe, I don't know, open a dialogue box with the universe itself. Lua shrugged, stepping forward. I'll give it a shot. Can't be harder than fixing Jenks' coffee machine. Hey, that machine is a temperamental work of art, Jenks protested, though his smile betrayed the lack of real annoyance. Lua approached the console cautiously, her fingers dancing over the holographic interface. Meanwhile, Vex kept her attention on the warriors, who were now watching her with expressions ranging from curious to outright bewildered. So, Taro said, falling into step beside her. What's plan B if this doesn't work? Vex shot him a sidelong glance. There is no plan B. We either get them back to their own time, or we audition for the role of incompetent space explorers in their next epic. Reckon we're a shoe-in, Taro replied with a wry grin. But maybe we should try to avoid that outcome. Lua worked quickly, her focus entirely on the console. The lights flickered, the ship's systems groaning like an old man with bad knees. Vex felt her heart rate spike, her mind racing with the possibilities of what might go wrong. This ship is like a grumpy old dog, Lua muttered, adjusting the stabilizer. Stubborn and only cooperative when it feels like it. Sounds about right, Vex replied, glancing back at the warriors. The Viking leader seemed to be communicating with his companions through a series of nods and grunts, the universal language of what the hell is happening. The rift pulsed, a strange light emanating from its depths. Vex prayed it was a sign that they were on the right track and not about to be sucked into a time-space blender. Okay, got it stabilized, Lua announced, relief evident in her voice. But if we want to send them back, we need some kind of trigger, something to bridge the gap. Vex frowned, thinking. A trigger, like a common element from their time. Exactly, Lua confirmed. Something they recognize, something that resonates with their era. It might help stabilize the bridge back to their timeline. Anyone got a spare longship lying around? Jenks piped up, half seriously. Not unless you count my old model kits, Taro replied with a smirk. But they are not exactly Viking-sized. Vex considered their options, desperate for inspiration. There had to be something, anything that could serve as a bridge. She scanned the corridor, her gaze landing on the Viking leader's helmet, a simple yet iconic piece of history. His helmet, Vex said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with a hint of madness. If we can use that, maybe it'll act as an anchor to their time, Taro blinked. You're going to ask him to hand over his helmet. You've got some stones, I'll give you that. Trust me, I'm aware, Vex replied, steeling herself. She stepped forward, pointing to the Viking leader's helmet and then to the rift, gesturing as clearly as she could. The Viking leader frowned deeper, clearly not happy with the prospect of parting with his headgear. Vex mimed pulling off an imaginary helmet, hoping her intentions would be clear. "Cap, you do realize that if this doesn't work, we're going to look really stupid, right?" Jenks reminded her, not unkindly. "Story of my life," Vex muttered. "But worth a shot." After what felt like an eternity, the Viking leader hesitated, then slowly removed his helmet, handing it over with the reluctance of a parent dropping their kid off for the first day of school. "Great, now don't drop it," Taro advised, as if fearing Vex might accidentally fling it into space. Lua adjusted the stabilizer again, inputting new parameters. "Let's hope this does the trick." Vex placed the helmet on the console, praying to whatever cosmic forces that govern time rifts and their odd sense of humor. The rift responded, shimmering brighter, the light intensifying until it was nearly blinding. The warriors watched, expressions a mix of awe and fear as the rift pulsed with energy. Vex held her breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. The helmet glowed, resonating with the rift's energy. Vex felt a tingle in her fingertips, as if the air itself was charged with static. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to hang in the balance, time itself holding its breath. Please work," Vex whispered under her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, as if in answer to her desperate plea, the rift expanded, enveloping the corridor in a wash of light. The warriors began to shimmer, their forms flickering like old footage caught between frames. Vex watched, almost disbelieving as the Viking leader nodded once, an acknowledgement of sorts. Then, one by one, the warriors vanished, their shapes dissolving into the light, leaving behind only the faintest echo of their presence. The rift pulsed one final time before collapsing in on itself, the light contracting until it was little more than a pinpoint on the horizon of their reality. The helmet, now devoid of its mystical glow, sat on the console, a silent reminder of what had transpired. "Well," Vex said, breaking the stunned silence. "That was something." "Something?" Taro echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I'd say that's the understatement of the century." Jenks let out a breath he'd been holding. "So, we're alive and the ship isn't trying to kill us. I call that a win." Lua nodded, her usual cool demeanor returning. "And we didn't even have to resort to mime." "Thank the stars for that," Vex replied, relief washing over her in waves. She picked up the helmet, turning it over in her hands. "Think this will make a good trophy?" "Only if you want to explain it to the brass," Taro pointed out, leaning against the wall with a weary grin. "Yeah, let's not," Vex decided, setting the helmet aside. "All right, let's get out of here before the universe changes its mind." As they made their way back to the shuttle, Vex couldn't shake the feeling that they'd dodged a cosmic bullet. The ardent star lay silent behind them, its mysteries and dangers left to whatever poor souls might stumble upon it next. "So, what's next?" Jenks asked, sliding into his seat with the ease of someone who'd had enough excitement for one day. "Next," Vex echoed, settling into her own seat with a contented sigh. "Next we get back to base, hand in our report, and hope they don't send us to another haunted ship." "Here's hoping," Lua said, closing her eyes. "I could use a vacation." "Yeah, somewhere without time rifts," Taro agreed, stretching his legs as the shuttle powered up. As they lifted off, leaving the derelict ship and its oddities behind, Vex allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. Space was still a cold, unforgiving place, full of surprises and snares, but for once they'd managed to outwit it. "Cheers to surviving another day," Vex said once more as they drifted into the vastness of space. "And to hoping the next job's a little less historical." The crew laughed, their voices a beacon of camaraderie against the silence of the void. And for a moment, it almost felt like space wasn't such a bastard after all. Vex Garrett leaned against the cool metallic wall of the ardent star's corridor, watching the rift shimmer like a cosmic mirage. She couldn't help but think of it as a persistent headache that refused to go away. The Viking leader and his contingent of misplaced warriors had just been successfully sent back to their time with the help of his helmet and some quick thinking. But the damn rift was still there, mocking them with its stubborn persistence. Well, That was a temporary reprieve, Vex muttered, more to herself than the crew. What is it about space that seems to amplify every problem we encounter? Taro asked, adjusting his sleeves with a look of disdain reserved for ill-fitting suits and malfunctioning technology. First, we get random warriors from history. Next, what? The rift starts spitting out dinosaurs. Please don't jinx it, Jenks said. He was pacing, his nervous energy palpable. We don't exactly have a strategy for dealing with giant lizards. Lua smirked, her fingers still dancing across the console like she was playing a high-stakes game of digital tic-tac-toe. I don't know, I think I'd make an excellent paleontologist, as long as I don't have to study their digestive systems from the inside. Vex chuckled despite herself. Let's focus on keeping our entrails firmly inside our bodies, all right. But their banter belied the serious danger they were in. The rift wasn't just a fancy light show. The damn thing was spreading, its creeping tendrils of unreality starting to mess with the ardent star's structural integrity. And by extension, their little slice of space, perhaps the universe, was at risk of becoming the next entry in Dumb Ways to Die. Lua frowned, her expression going from mildly amused to outright concerned. The ship systems are reporting fluctuations. It's like the rift is trying to suck the ship into some cosmic blender. Fantastic, Vex replied, her voice laden with sarcasm. That's exactly what we need. A giant blender with us on the menu. Taro threw his hands up in mock celebration. I always wanted to be part of a smoothie, just not this one. The ship gave a groan, a deep, unsettling sound that rumbled through the corridors. Vex cursed under her breath. Jenks, can you go check the engine room? Make sure nothing's about to explode. Right, Jenks nodded, making his way down the corridor as if he were off to defuse a bomb, which, in many ways, he was. Vex turned back to Lua. How do we stabilize this thing and keep it from turning our ship into a cosmic curiosity? Well, the Viking helmet trick might not work twice, Lua said, biting her lip. But if we can find another anchor point, we might be able to at least contain the rift. Another anchor point from their time. Great. Now all we need is a medieval flea market, Taro quipped. Doubt they take credit, Vex replied dryly. Okay, let's think. What do we have on this ship that could possibly resonate with a time rift full of Vikings? Not much, Lua admitted. But maybe we don't need something from their time. Maybe we just need something old, something with history. Vex considered this, her mind racing through their inventory. There's that antique navigation sextant in the captain's quarters. Would that do the trick? It's worth a shot. It's older than most of the junk on this ship, Lua said, already turning back to the console. Great. I'm on it, Vex said, heading down the corridor with Taro following close behind. And let's hope this sextant doesn't decide to throw us back to the age of sea shanties. You think we could survive on rum and hardtack? Taro asked with a wry grin. At this point, I'd take my chances, Vex replied, pushing open the door to the captain's quarters. The room was as drab as the rest of the ship, the kind of utilitarian design that screamed function over form. But amidst the dullness sat the sextant, glinting dully in the overhead light. Well, hello there, Taro said, lifting it with exaggerated care. Let's hope this rust bucket's more useful than a paperweight. Or a paperweight with aspirations, Vex added, taking it from him. As they made their way back to the bridge, the ship groaned again, a sound that felt far too organic for their liking. They shared a look, one that said everything they didn't need to articulate. Time was running out. Lua was waiting for them, her expression a mixture of determination and thinly veiled anxiety. Did you find our lucky charm? Vex held up the sextant. Let's hope it lives up to the hype. Otherwise, we're going to be the punchline to a very cosmic joke. Lua took the sextant, placing it carefully on the console. The ship's lights flickered ominously, as if the rift was aware of their efforts and not pleased about being outwitted. Okay, here goes nothing, Lua said, adjusting the stabilizer settings with the sextant as a central focus. If this works, we might just be able to stop the rift from expanding. And if it doesn't? Taro asked, though his tone was more curious than worried. Let's just say our next role might involve wearing very historical outfits, Vex replied, leaning over Lua's shoulder as she worked. The ship shuddered again, and Vex could swear she saw the walls pulse, as if the ardent star itself was breathing. Or maybe she was just losing it. Lua muttered a few choice words under her breath, her fingers blurring over the controls. Every time I think I've got this thing figured out, it decides to be contrary. That's life in a nutshell, Vex said. If it was easy, we'd all be bored out of our minds, Taro snorted. As opposed to the thrill of being slowly consumed by a time rift. Exactly, Vex said, deadpan. Lua hit a final key, stepping back. Okay, that's it. Now we wait and pray to the gods of unreliable technology. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Vex found herself holding her breath, watching as the rift flickered, almost like it was considering their proposition. Then slowly, the rift's pulsating slowed, like a beast reluctantly settling down. The sextant glowed, a faint light enveloping it, spreading outwards. Vex could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand on end as if she just walked into a room with a high-voltage charge. Is that a good sign or a bad sign? Taro asked, not taking his eyes off the spectacle. Honestly, your guess is as good as mine, Vex said, but her voice was hopeful, a rare commodity in their line of work. The rift seemed to contract slightly, the edges less frantic, as if the universe itself was sighing in relief. The ship's groans subsided, fading into silence. It wasn't fully stable, but the immediate threat seemed to have lessened. Lua let out a breath she'd been holding. I think it's working. Great. So we won't be playing Guess the Century today, Vex said with a grin. But for how long? Jenks asked, rejoining them with a grease-stained face and the resigned air of a man who'd just fought an engine and lost. This could give out any second. Vex nodded, acknowledging the grim truth of their situation. Which means we need a more permanent solution, but at least this gives us a chance. Taro clapped his hands together. So, what's the plan, Cap? Do we make like heroes and dive back into the unknown, or do we head back and let the suits figure it out? Vex considered their options, weighing the risk of staying against the absolute certainty of fielding a dozen idiotic questions from their superiors if they bailed. We stick it out a little longer. We've got a temporary fix, but we need to make sure this rift doesn't start acting up again the minute we turn our backs. Great, Lua said, her sarcasm as dry as a desert. More quality time with our favorite cosmic anomaly. Jenks sighed, slumping into a chair. Why do I feel like we're going to regret this decision? Because we probably will, Vex admitted. But hey, who wants to die of boredom? The crew shared a grim laugh, the kind that only people who regularly faced near-certain death could muster. With the momentarily stabilized rift behind them and the ardent star's mysteries ahead, their work was far from done. But for now, they'd take the small victories where they could find them and hope that their luck, along with their wit, would hold out just a little bit longer. Vex was doing her best to ignore the fact that their temporary victory was more akin to sticking a band-aid on a sucking chest wound. The rift had calmed, sure, but it was the kind of calm that preceded a spectacularly loud explosion. Like the one time Taro had tried his hand at cooking, and the galley spent the next week smelling like burned regret. The ardent star was holding together, but just barely, and the mood on the bridge was teetering between defiant optimism and outright despair. Which, if Vex was being honest, was pretty much their default setting anyway. All right, crew, Vex announced, leaning against the console with the grace of someone at the end of their tether. I know it looks bleak. But if we can keep this rust bucket from disintegrating for a little longer, we might actually live to see our next paychecks. That's assuming the company doesn't use our near deaths as a reason to dock our hazard pay, Taro said, crossing his arms. I mean, they already lose our paperwork more frequently than we lose socks in the dryer. Or we could all just wake up in the past and start a cult, Lua added with a smirk. Imagine the headlines. Spacefaring time travelers bring fidget spinners to the Dark Ages. Yeah, and get burned at the stake for witchcraft, Vex replied dryly. Pass? Jenks, who was still wiping engine grease from his hands onto a rag that was more grime than cloth at this point, looked up with wide eyes. "Ugh, guys, I think the rift is getting peckish again." He was right. The rift, which had been behaving like a recently sedated tiger, was perking up, its tendrils of unreality starting to creep back into the ship's systems. Its enthusiasm for chaos was infectious, like a toddler hopped up on candy. "So much for our lucky charm," Lua muttered, stabbing at the console like it owed her money. "Looks like we're back on the menu, boys and girls." "We need another plan," Vex said, though her voice was lacking conviction. Plans were like sandcastles right now, crumbling under the slightest pressure. "Maybe we should just embrace the chaos," Taro suggested with a shrug. "Go full pirate. I've always wanted an eye patch." "How about we don't go embracing anything that might get us all killed?" Vex shot back. "Call me old-fashioned, but I prefer my skulls without crossbones." The ship shivered like it was trying to shake off an itch, and the bridge lights flickered, casting shadows that had no business being there. It was like being inside a haunted house, only with less popcorn and more imminent doom. Okay, Lua cut in, her fingers a blur over the keyboard. "Maybe if we recalibrate the stabilizers again, we can buy ourselves a little more time. We need to keep the rift from gobbling us up long enough to find a real solution." "Real solution? You're talking about a miracle," Jenks pointed out. "Well, miracles are just science we haven't figured out yet," Lua replied, her usual sarcasm flavored with a dash of hope. "So let's get sciencing." Vex nodded, even as doubt gnawed at her insides. "All right, Lua, do your magic. Taro, see if you can reroute power from non-essential systems. And Jenks, keep an eye on the engines. Last thing we need is to explode from the inside out." "And what about you?" Taro asked, pausing halfway to the power conduits. "I'm going to see if I can get us a direct line to HQ, Vex said. "We need backup, or at the very least someone to blame when this all goes south." Taro gave a mock salute, then got to work while Vex retreated to the comms panel. The ship was alive with the sound of stressed-out engineers and the groan of metal under duress, an orchestra of impending catastrophe. "Command, this is the Ardent Star," Vex said into the comm, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're in deep cosmic trouble here. Can you hear me?" The response was static, which was about as helpful as a chocolate hammer in a heat wave. Vex grit her teeth, cursing under her breath. Of course, the one time she needed the bureaucracy to function, and it was MIA. "Should we start writing our wills?" Lua asked, glancing over with a grim smile. "I call dibs on Vex's boots. You can have them, but only if you dig me out of whatever cosmic burial site we end up in," Vex replied, tapping the comms panel again in frustration. "Command, if you can hear this, we need immediate assistance. The rift is compromising our structural integrity, and we're running out of options and witty banter." "Speak for yourself," Taro interjected, rerouting power with all the grace of a drunken ballet dancer. "I've got years of sarcasm left in me." "Yeah, but once we're all ghosts, you're going to have a hard time getting anyone to listen," Vex pointed out. The comms crackled, a mocking reminder of how alone they were out here. Then, with the timing of a bad punchline, the rift belched out another surprise. The air shimmered, and with a sound like tearing fabric, a figure stumbled onto the bridge. Clad in dented armor and looking as confused as a tourist without a map was a medieval knight. Of course. "Well, I guess the rift was feeling generous," Taro said, eyeing the newcomer with mild curiosity. The knight gaped around, his hand moving to his sword with the reflexes of someone who'd seen too many battlefields. "What devilry is this?" he bellowed in a language that was just comprehensible enough for Vex to catch his drift. "Devilry, meet technology," Vex said, gesturing to the array of blinking lights. "Technology, meet devilry." The knight squinted at her, clearly trying to decide if he was in a particularly vivid dream or in the afterlife. Vex couldn't blame him. She'd been asking herself the same question since they'd first encountered this cursed rift. "Be at ease," Lua said, holding up her hands in a placating gesture that might have worked if she wasn't covered in grease, and looking more like a mad scientist than a welcome wagon. "We're not your enemies, just fellow victims of cosmic nonsense." The knight hesitated, then seemed to decide there were worse fates than being kidnapped by futuristic peasants. He sheathed his sword, though his eyes continued darting around like he expected a dragon to swoop in at any moment. "So, I guess we can add Knight to our list of unexpected guests," Jenks said, shaking his head. "Maybe we should start charging admission." "If we make it out of here alive, I'll consider it," Vex said, her voice a mix of frustration and resolve. "For now, let's focus on not becoming cosmic dust." Lua had returned to her console, fingers dancing again as she recalibrated the stabilizers. The rift continued to pulse ominously, as if it was waiting for them to slip up. It was a predator toying with its prey, and Vex hated feeling like they were one misstep from becoming dinner. "We've got a little more time," Lua announced, her voice a thin thread of hope. "But not much. It's like trying to hold back the tide with a sponge." "Then let's make the most of it," Vex said, her eyes scanning the bridge for any sign that the universe was cutting them some slack. She found none. "Jenks, any chance we can boost the engines? Just in case we need to make a quick escape." Jenks hesitated, clearly weighing the odds. "I can try. But if I push them too hard, we might end up scattering our atoms across the void. And if we don't do something, we're going to end up scattered anyway," Vex pointed out. "Do what you can." "On it," Jenks said, heading back toward the engine room with the heavy tread of a man facing his own executioner. The knight, who'd been silently absorbing the chaos around him, finally spoke. "I know not where I am, but I will lend my sword to your cause." Vex raised an eyebrow. "That's generous of you, but unless you can figure out how to cut a rift in time, I'm not sure your sword's going to help much." The knight nodded, though he looked disappointed. "Then I shall stand ready should you need my blade." "Well, at least he's not trying to kill us," Taro said, offering the knight a thumbs up. "Which is more than I can say for our last dinner guests." Lua snorted, continuing her work, her focus unyielding despite the odds. The bridge was a tense cacophony of beeps, whirs, and the occasional medieval exclamation of "by the saints." The rift loomed large, an uninvited guest with a penchant for causing headaches and existential dread. "Command, this is Vex Garrett of the Ardent Star." Vex tried again, her voice hard with determination. "We're in the middle of a time anomaly and need immediate extraction. We've got a rift that refuses to close and a ship that's on the verge of becoming a very expensive fireworks display." Silence. Then, a crackle and a voice so faint it might have been an auditory hallucination. "Ardent Star, this is command. Hold your position. Backup is en route." Vex exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "Backup's coming," she informed the crew. "We just need to keep ourselves in one piece until they get here." Taro gave a cheer, though it lacked real enthusiasm. "So what you're saying is we're not totally screwed, just mostly screwed." "Exactly," Vex replied, a glint of humor in her eyes. "And in our line of work, that's a win." The knight looked between them, clearly trying to follow the conversation. "So, we are to hold this fortress until reinforcements arrive." "Something like that," Lua replied, not missing a beat. "Though our fortress is a bit more temperamental." The knight chuckled, a surprisingly warm sound in the tension-filled air. "Then let us hope your reinforcements are swift and your fortress holds." The rift pulsed again, reminding them all that their temporary reprieve was just that, temporary. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Vex allowed herself a grim smile. They might not be out of the woods yet, but at least they had a breadcrumb trail to follow. And if they were very, very lucky, they'd live to see if their insurance covered time anomalies. Vex rubbed her temples, trying to massage away the impending headache that was demanding its due. The knight continued to gaze around the bridge, as if expecting a minstrel to pop up and start serenading him. She turned her attention back to the rift, its foreboding presence looming over them like a cosmic tax auditor. "All right, team," she called, her voice cutting through the ambient sounds of the ship's struggling systems. "We need a plan that doesn't end with us becoming space confetti." "Got it, Captain Optimism," Taro quipped as he fiddled with a panel that looked one short circuit away from a barbecue. "I'll just check my miracle drawer. Oh wait, it's empty." Vex shot him a look that could have frozen a sun. "Well, start digging, Taro. Maybe you'll find one underneath all that sarcasm." "Hey, sarcasm's my second language." "Right after desperate flailing," Taro replied, his grin as unrepentant as ever. As if on cue, the ship's intercom crackled to life, and a voice that hadn't been heard in Iors finally made an appearance. Quill Tarsus, the crew's resident linguist and expert in ancient grumbles, popped up on the screen. She looked like she'd been pulled out of a history book and forced into a world where her skills were only occasionally useful, like now. "Folks, I think I have something," Quill announced, brushing past formalities like they were unwelcome guests. Her hair was a mess of curls that seemed to defy gravity almost as well as the ship. "I've been studying the readings from the rift, and I think there's a pattern." "A pattern?" "Like a cross-stitch or more like a how we're about to die kind of pattern." Lua's voice cracked through the air, her fingers still glued to her keyboard. "More like a how to not die pattern," Quill replied, her voice tinged with cautious excitement. "I've been looking at the temporal anomalies, and there's a sequence that suggests there might be a way to reverse the rift." The room went silent, the kind of silence where everyone holds their breath just in case breathing is the thing that'll break the spell. "You're serious?" Vex asked, skepticism lacing her tone like a seasoned drinker laces their coffee. "You can actually stop this thing." "I didn't say stop," Quill corrected, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I said reverse. If we input the right sequence, it might theoretically close the rift." Taro let out a low whistle. "Theoretically, love that word. It's like probably, but with more room for disaster." "Isn't that our whole lives out here?" Lua said, a wry smile playing on her lips. "Theoretical survival, theoretical paycheck, theoretical not getting blown up." "Exactly," Quill replied, her gaze bouncing between her notes and the expectant faces on the screen. "But it's a chance, and right now it's the only one we've got." "So what do we need to do?" Vex asked, cutting to the chase. She was many things, but a fan of suspense wasn't one of them. "We need to input a series of calculations into the ship's mainframe to create a counterpulse," Quill explained. "It should, in theory, collapse the rift. And by theory, you mean there's a 50-50 chance we'll survive." Jenks chimed in, leaning against the frame of the door, looking like he'd wrestled a bear and lost. Quill shrugged. "It's better odds than most of our plans." "Great. So how do we start?" Vex asked, her voice a mix of determination and looming dread. It was the trademark sound of someone about to play a really high-stakes game of poker. Quill launched into a detailed explanation, her hands moving in sync with her words as if conducting an invisible orchestra. The rest of the crew gathered around, absorbing the information with varying levels of confidence and skepticism. Even the knight, who'd been keeping a respectful silence, looked intrigued. "So, we just have to run these calculations, input them, and pray to whatever cosmic entity hasn't abandoned us yet," Taro summarized, raising an eyebrow. "Basically," Quill nodded, her expression a blend of hope and the kind of insanity that only made sense in their line of work. "All right," Vex said, clapping her hands together like a coach about to send the team into the final play. "Let's get to it. Jenks, Taro, you're on calculation duty with Quill. Lua, keep those stabilizers steady and ready. And our esteemed knight—" "I shall guard the door," the knight interjected, assuming a stance that was equal parts noble and unnecessarily dramatic. "Perfect," Vex nodded. "The last thing we need is an interdimensional door-to-door salesman." The crew dispersed, each going to their designated task with a resolve that often came when one was staring down certain doom. There was a strange comfort in having a plan, even if it was a questionable one. It beat the alternative of sitting around and waiting for fate to deal its hand. Vex stationed herself at the comms panel, keeping an ear out for any word from command. Meanwhile, Quill, Taro, and Jenks huddled around the ship's mainframe, looking like gamblers betting it all on the longest shot of their lives. "All right, let's do this," Quill said, her voice the steady beacon amidst the chaos. "Taro, you take the first sequence. Jinx, you're on the second. I'll handle the third. And remember, no pressure, it's just the fate of our lives and the universe at stake. Fantastic, Taro muttered as he began inputting the calculations, his fingers moving with mechanical certainty. If we pull this off, I'm putting Save the Universe on my resume, right under Professional Sarcastic Bastard. Just don't fry the circuits, Taro, Jenks warned, his focus absolute as he worked through his own sequence. I'd rather not go out because of a typo. Lua, now stationed at the stabilizers, kept one eye on the fluctuating readouts and another on the clock. Time was not on their side, and the rift's pulse felt like the slow, steady countdown to an explosion they desperately needed to defuse. "How's it going, folks?" Vex asked, her voice a steady anchor that kept the team tethered to a sliver of hope. "We're getting there," Quill replied, her brow furrowed in concentration as she inputted the final sequence. "Just a few more lines and there." She pressed the final key with a flourish, and for a moment nothing happened. The silence was oppressive, a beast that threatened to swallow them whole. Then slowly the rift began to change. The pulsing slowed, its edges shimmering as if unsure of its own existence. "It's working," Quill said, her voice barely above a whisper, awe and relief battling for dominance. "Well, I'll be damned," Taro grinned, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "We might actually pull this off." But just as hope began to take root, the ship shuddered violently, throwing everyone off balance. The rift, perhaps offended by their audacity, flared back to life, its instability wreaking havoc on the ship's systems. "What the hell?" Jenks shouted, steadying himself against the console. "I thought we had it." "We did," Quill said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But something's interfering with the sequence. Can we fix it?" Vex demanded, her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. "I'm trying," Quill replied, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "But whatever it is, it's strong." "I'm not sure we can." Before she could finish, another ripple tore through the ship and the lights flickered ominously. The rift seemed to feed off their attempts, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Vex, we need to do something," Lua called, her voice rising above the din of chaos. "The stabilizers are maxed out. We can't hold this much longer." Vex's mind raced, the weight of their situation pressing down with the force of 1,000 gravities. They needed a miracle and fast. "All right," she said, a plan forming in the eye of the storm. "Jenks, can we boost the power to the counterpulse? Overload it, force the rift to collapse." Jenks hesitated, his mind calculating the risk. "We could try, but it'll fry the whole system. We might not get another chance if it fails." "Then let's not fail," Vex replied, a steely determination in her eyes. "We're doing this. Now." The team sprang into action, their movements synchronized in a desperate bid for survival. Jenks rerouted power from every non-essential system, while Taro and Quill recalibrated the sequence, their focus unwavering. Lua, sensing the shift, steadied the stabilizers, her hands moving with practiced precision. The knight, for all the madness around him, stood guard, his presence a reminder of the chaos that had brought them to this moment. "Ready when you are, Vex," Quill called, her voice a lifeline in the chaos. "Do it," Vex ordered, her heart in her throat. Jenks hit the final command, and the ship hummed with a power that resonated through its very core. The rift, once a menacing force, began to shrink, its energy folding in on itself like a collapsing star. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, with a final, defiant gasp, the rift imploded, taking with it the threat of annihilation and leaving behind a silence that was both eerie and comforting. "We did it," Taro said, disbelief coloring his words as the realization sank in. "By the saints," the knight muttered, lowering his sword as if in reverence of the moment. Vex let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "We did it. Great work, everyone." The crew shared a moment of quiet triumph, their faces weary but alive with the knowledge that they'd cheated death one more time. It wasn't over yet, but for now they'd earned their victory. "Guess we're not just theoretical survivors anymore," Lua said, a tired smile on her face. "No," Vex agreed, her gaze sweeping over her team with pride. "Now we're the real deal." In the wake of chaos, hope had returned, a fragile thing that promised them another day, another battle. And for Vex and her crew, that was more than enough. The ardent star trembled like a half-drunk sailor trying to find his sea legs. Vex Garrett stood on the bridge with the air of someone who'd been slapped awake by reality and was not happy about it. The ship was barely holding together, and the rift, a swirling migraine made manifest, seemed determined to rip them a new one. "Taro, I need those calculations yesterday," Vex barked over the crackling ship's intercom. Her voice had the edge of a rusty blade, barely holding back the ship's creaks and groans. "Sure thing, Vex," Taro replied, hands busy at the panel like a pianist trying to play Chopin on a keyboard missing half its keys. "Lucky for you, I majored in miracle math back at university." "Yeah, what you minor in?" "Advanced sarcasm," Jenks chimed in, head buried in a mess of wires that looked more suitable for spaghetti night than a spaceship. "Graduated with honors," Taro shot back, fingers dancing over the keys. Quill Tarsis, their resident linguist and all-around rift whisperer, paced the bridge. She looked like a teacher stuck with a classroom full of delinquents, frustrated, but with a begrudging fondness for the chaos. "Remember, we just need to input these sequences with a little more finesse than a bull in a china shop. The plan, if you can call it that, is in motion," Lua announced from her station, eyes flitting between the stabilizer's jittery readouts. They were twitching more than a caffeinated squirt. "Finesse is overrated," Vex grumbled, her headache building like a symphony of hammers. "Just get it done." The ship's lights flickered, and a low hum filled the bridge. The historical warriors, pulled through time by the rift's capricious tendrils, stood awkwardly on deck. The knight, the most vocal of the lot, tapped his sword against the floor, a sound that resonated like a warning bell. "What sorcery is this? The kind that'll send you back to your merry medieval mud pit if it all goes well," Taro quipped, not taking his eyes off the screen. "So cross your fingers, or whatever you people did for luck back then." The knight huffed, clearly unimpressed with future technology and the sarcasm it ran on. He resumed his post at the door, a relic guarding against the encroaching insanity. Meanwhile, Quill wrestled with numbers and symbols as if they were wild animals refusing to be tamed. "We're almost there," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Almost there," Vex repeated, massaging her temples. Famous last words. The ship lurched. Everyone grabbed onto something sturdy or someone, while Vex cursed under her breath, colorful enough to put a rainbow to shame. Jenks, who had managed to extricate himself from the wiring hell, shouted across the bridge. "We've got a power spike in the system. This whole thing's going to blow if we don't stabilize it." "Fantastic," Vex muttered. "Just what we needed." "Can you fix it, or should I start writing my will?" "I'll see what I can do," Jenks replied, diving back into the console like a miner after gold but finding only fool's errands. "Lua, how are those stabilizers?" Vex asked, more as a formality than expectation. She already knew the answer, not good. "They're holding by the grace of the universe's cruel sense of humor," Lua said, her tone as dry as a desert in a drought. "Could use a little less cosmic irony." Quill glanced at Vex, a mixture of hope and desperation in her eyes. "We're at the final sequence. Once it's in, the rift should start to collapse." "Should," Vex echoed skeptically. "My favorite word." Quill's fingers flew over the keyboard, striking the final keys with the determination of a gambler betting everything on black. For a moment, the rift hesitated, an eye in the storm of chaos surrounding them. "It's working," Quill breathed, as the rift's violent energy began to wane, like a tantrum-throwing toddler finally tuckered out. "Don't count your chickens," Taro warned, but somewhere in his voice was a thread of genuine hope. The knight, sensing a shift in the tide, stepped forward. "Is our doom averted?" "Not exactly," Vex replied, eyeballing the rift like it owed her money. "But it's delayed." Which in our line of work is as good as a win. The rift, clearly offended by the crew's audacity, flared one last time, its death throes shaking the ship to its core. The lights dimmed, the air went static, and for a heartbeat everything stood still. Then it was gone. The bridge descended into a silence so profound it felt like a tangible weight. Vex exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing as the reality of their survival settled in. "We did it," Jenks asked, as if the universe might still come back for a second round. "We did it," Quill confirmed, eyes reflecting the quiet triumph of a miracle worker who wasn't entirely sure how the magic trick worked. Taro leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Well, would you look at that? Maybe we're not just a bunch of space-bound screw-ups after all." The knight, having witnessed what must have seemed like sorcery beyond comprehension, bowed his head. "My thanks, brave warriors of the stars." "Brave, maybe," Lua interjected, "but don't go carving our faces into any statues just yet." Vex, ever the realist, wasn't about to let her guard down. "All right, let's not pat ourselves on the back too hard. We've still got a ship to keep from falling apart and a knight to send home." Quill nodded, already considering the logistics of returning the historical figures. "I'll start working on the temporal recalibration." "Good," Vex replied, her tone softening slightly. "And while you're at it, see if you can find a way to eliminate my headache." "Priority 2, obviously," Taro snorted. "You mean after saving the universe, fixing your headache isn't number 1? We all have priorities," Vex shot back, her smile faint but genuine. Jenks, looking like he'd wrestled a hurricane and won, glanced around at the crew. "Is it just me, or did we actually pull off the space equivalent of pulling a rabbit out of a hat?" Lua chuckled, the sound a relief after the tension. "Not just you, but don't get too comfortable. If there's one thing I've learned out here, it's that space loves to throw curveballs." "Here's hoping the next one's a little less explosive," Quill added, her relief tempered by caution. "Well, if it is," Taro said, "at least we've got the universe's most sarcastic knight to help out." The knight inclined his head, clearly unsure of what to make of Taro's comment but choosing to take it in stride. "Your jesting is most peculiar." "That's one way to put it," Vex agreed, crossing her arms and surveying her motley crew, each member an essential cog in the dysfunctional machine that had somehow managed to save the day. The ardent star, though battered and bruised, felt like it had a heartbeat again. The rift was closed, the ship was stable, at least for now, and they'd bought themselves a little time to breathe. "All right, everyone," Vex said, her tone a mix of leadership and camaraderie. "Let's get to work on repairs and then figure out how to get this guy back to his time." "Another day, another impossible task," Taro quipped, stretching as if he'd just finished a long shift at a desk job rather than a life-threatening mission. "Wouldn't have it any other way," Vex replied, her tone carrying the weight of 1,000 other trials they'd survived together. The crew dispersed, each returning to their stations with the knowledge that they'd pulled off something incredible. The rift was closed, the warriors would be sent home, and the ardent star would sail through the void for another day. As they worked, the camaraderie grew, born from shared danger and the grim satisfaction of knowing they'd defied the odds. It wasn't perfect, but then neither were they. And that was okay. Because out here in the cold expanse of space, perfection was overrated. "Hey, Vex," Taro called over his shoulder, a mischievous glint in his eye. "If we survive the next rift, drinks are on you." Vex laughed, the sound a rare but welcome addition to the bridge. "You've got a deal, but only if they serve something strong enough to make me forget the last 24 hours." And with that, the crew of the Ardent Star returned to their duties, confident for once that they'd earned their right to fight another day. The Ardent Star hummed quietly, the rift finally sealed like a stubborn lid on a jar of pickles. The bridge was still a mess, wires dangling from the ceiling like the ship's failed attempt at modern art, but it was the kind of chaos that felt oddly comforting after the storm. Vex Garrett leaned back in her chair, pushing her fingers through her hair. The headache was still there, but it had downgraded to a mere nuisance, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. "All right, team, we might not be dead, so that's something." Taro, still at his station, shook his head. "Is it just me, or does it feel like we were just in a cosmic blender? Someone should really put a warning label on those rifts." And what would it say? Warning may cause historical indigestion, Lua replied dryly, her hands finally leaving the stabilizers alone. They'd whined and jittered like kids on a sugar high, but had held steady in the end. Quill, the Rift Whisperer herself, was still catching her breath. We should compose a thank you note to the universe, maybe send it with a batch of cookies. Think that'd cover us for next time. Assuming the universe eats cookies, Jenks snorted, taking a break from his battle with the wiring. He looked around at the pile of medieval warriors who were now mostly just gawking at the strange metal beast they found themselves in. Can't believe these guys. I mean, it's like we're running a hotel for time-lost tourists now. Vex smirked, glancing at the knight who seemed to be trying very hard to make sense of things. Well, they say desperate times call for desperate measures. Guess they got desperate enough to hitch a ride with us idiots. The knight, overhearing, decided to finally speak. Your vessel is strange and your humor stranger, but I owe you my thanks. I would have thought this the devil's work if not for your aid. That's us, Taro said, raising a non-existent glass. Always here to save the day and ruin the devil's plans. Just another Tuesday in the galaxy. The air was lightening, the jokes coming easier now that death wasn't staring them down like a bored cat with a mouse. But Vex wasn't quite done being serious. Not yet. All right, crew. We've got a ship to patch up, warriors to return, and probably a million other things to do that I've already forgotten about. Typical Tuesday, Lua echoed, standing and stretching, her limbs cracking like old machinery. Just let me know when we can pencil in a nap. You'll get your beauty sleep when this tin can's not falling apart, Jenks said, returning to his tangled mess of wires. Quill, already moving towards the temporal calibration controls, paused. You know, I think we accidentally proved time travel's not all it's cracked up to be, Vex snorted. What gave it away? The medieval stowaways or the fact that our ship's been holding together by sheer spite? Spite's a powerful force, Taro added. It got us this far. The knight, looking more at ease than he had any right to, nodded solemnly. Spite, a familiar ally to us warriors. Great, Vex muttered. Now I've got to worry about historical warriors and Spite as allies. My kingdom for a drink. The crew set to work, each with their tasks. Jenks was elbows deep in the ship's guts, cursing under his breath but with a kind of fondness for the ship that only someone who'd been electrocuted by it 1,000 times could have. Lua was prowling the stabilizers again, double-checking everything twice, her trust in them akin to a long-suffering parent convinced their kids up to something. Quill, with an odd serenity, helped their misplaced warriors. She muttered numbers and symbols like a shaman casting a spell, with the knight looking on as if witnessing a miracle. I think I've got it, she said at last, the tiniest hint of self-doubt creeping in. Got what? Vex asked, though she already knew. She just wanted to hear it. The way back for them, Quill confirmed, should be like rewinding a tape, in theory. Taro shook his head with a grin. Always loved a good theory. Especially when it's someone else testing it. The knight seemed to gather his courage, stepping forward. My thanks truly. And if it doesn't work? Jenks asked from inside his wire nest, always the optimist. Quill shrugged. Then we get a new crew member. Vex chuckled, though it was more of an exhale than a laugh. All right, send him back. And let's hope Spacetime wants to play nice. With the push of a button and a series of increasingly complex keystrokes that would have given a normal person a migraine, Quill activated the temporal recalibration. The air shimmered, the sound of reality twisting a song only Quill seemed to hear. And then, with a pop more appropriate to a champagne cork than a warrior's departure, the night was gone. Well, Lua said after a beat, he didn't explode, so I call that a win. Good enough for government work, Taro agreed. Vex shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. You know, I don't think I've ever seen a job go that smoothly. Don't jinx it, Quill warned, finally allowing herself to relax. The universe has a way of listening at the worst possible times. Like a nosy neighbor, Jenks added, finally extracting himself from the wiring with a triumphant grin. 1 minute you're just trying to fix a power surge, next thing you know, You've got half of medieval Europe camping in your living room. As they settled into this new, quieter chaos, the ship felt alive again. Not just a hunk of metal drifting through space, but a home with its own heartbeat, its own quirks and humor, even if it was the kind you wanted to punch sometimes. "So, homeward bound then?" Lua asked, her voice a mix of relief and anticipation. "Homeward bound," Vex confirmed, gazing out into the void. "Whatever the hell that means for us," Taro snorted. "Probably means more paperwork. They always forget to mention that part in the adventure stories." "Or more rifts," Jenks said deadpan. "Wouldn't that be a treat?" Quill, ever the optimist despite everything, just smiled. "Well, if it's more rifts, at least we've got experience now. Who knew cosmic anomalies could be such great teachers?" "Wonderful," Vex said, her sarcasm as thick as ever. "Now let's get this flying scrapyard back to base before the universe decides to test us again." With that, the crew of the Ardent Star turned their attention to the journey ahead. The rift had been a test, a cosmic joke at their expense, but somehow they'd managed to laugh back. They had survived, and in the cold, uncaring expanse of space, that was the greatest victory of all. The ship's engines hummed to life, and the Ardent Star set its course for home. The stars blurred by outside, a reminder of the vast, indifferent galaxy that they'd somehow managed to carve their own small corner of survival in. "I have to hand it to you, Vex," Taro said, leaning back in his seat. "You really know how to pick your adventures." "Yeah, well," Vex replied, smiling despite herself. "Next time remind me to pick one with a spa and a beach." "Only if you find the time-traveling knights," Lua added, grinning. "Deal," Vex agreed, her tone lighter than it had been in days. "But first, let's get this bucket of bolts back in one piece." The journey continued, the crew settling into a comfortable routine once more. The Ardent Star, for all its faults and failings, was a part of them now. And as they sailed through the cosmos, they knew that whatever came their way, they'd meet it with the same irreverent humor and stubborn defiance that had carried them through so far. Because in the end, they were more than just a crew. They were a family of misfits, bound together by the absurdity of their circumstances and the shared laughter that had seen them through the worst the universe could throw at them. And as Vex leaned back, staring at the stars that stretched endlessly ahead, she couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they'd found their place among them.